Hi guys, normally I start these videos off with many statistics about the topic I'm discussing, but today I want to make this a more personal experience. With that said, the Office for National Statistics states that over 51% of those who experience child abuse also experience abuse such as domestic violence as an adult. The more types of abuse suffered as a child, physical, emotional, sexual, and so on, the more likely the survivor will experience abuse as an adult, 77% to be exact. More than a third of those who were abused by a family member as a child go on to be abused by a partner as an adult. The same statistics stand for those who experience sexual abuse as a child and then go on to experience sexual abuse as an adult at around 33%. As you're aware by now, I experienced physical, mental, and sexual abuse as a child. But unfortunately, unlike in the books written by other people on their experiences, I was not rescued by a handsome suitor. When you're abused as a child, your mental age stays at the age the trauma was the worst. For me, this was around 11 years old, as it was when my abuse took darker turns and I began to realise that due to my mother sexually abusing my foster sister, 13 at the time, that my abuse was not my fault. This meant that I began to make decisions about my life, stuck at the age of 11. Although I was very mature for my age, I did end up making a lot of childish decisions, which was extremely dangerous to my personal safety. But I also thought that considering what I was already going through, how could things get any worse? This not only shows the depths of my naivety, but also the seriousness of the abuse I was suffering at the time. I would do anything to escape my own personal hell, and I knew I couldn't take it much longer. Either I'd end up taking my own life, or my mother would. And this meant I talked to strangers online, convinced myself to trust anyone who I thought could help me, particularly men, and eventually led me to leave my mother for the first time to essentially live with a stranger. My first abusive relationship after I left home, as my mother had aided in other abusive relationships whilst I was still a child, included telling someone how to rape me. This was my first sexual experience other than the abuse I suffered as a toddler. I only call these relationships for you to understand it as it wasn't what it was. I was with a 19-year-old man when I was 16. I was at college in total despair and not knowing where my life would go or how much more I could take. Someone I was on the course with introduced me to him and another man who would later go on to be my first husband. But as I think this is going to be a lengthy topic, I will split it over multiple videos. So I started to spend a lot of time with this man, began skipping classes, allowing him to sexually abuse me as at the time I was just a child, particularly mentally, and he was an adult. I started to go off the rails, but I also began to tell him bits about my home life, which he experienced in person when I brought him back to my house once. He could see the mental torment, although they didn't physically assault me in front of him. I could see him as my way out and would do anything for that escape at the time. I had no self-worth or respect for my body as it had already been used and abused against my will, and I hated myself with no self-esteem to speak of, so why not give him what he wanted if it meant I could escape? We began to plan my escape as I had no bedroom and minimal belongings to speak of at the time. It made it easier to escape. Except there was one problem, the hold my mother had over me mentally. So the first night I planned to escape, I told him I'd fallen asleep as I was just too scared to leave. Scared what my mother might do, scared what the world would really be like, and scared about putting all my trust into this man, which in fairness I barely knew. I sent him explicit pictures and explicit messages, as I already knew at this age that it was relinquishing my body that would get me what I wanted and needed. And this was a small price to pay, right? So the second night, I got up the courage to actually do it. I left with just the clothes on my back and nothing else. I was terrified, shaking head to toe. And the mind remembers funny things in traumatic experiences, and all I remember was sitting in the back of this car and him asking me if I wanted McDonald's. His house was not what I was used to, and it was a bomb site, really, cold and unwelcoming. His dad was also abusive to him and didn't seem to be there half the time. But I knew I had to make it work. I had no clothes, but he had a sister and said he would give me some of her clothes, which the extent of my body dysmorphia at the time told me would not fit. I was used to wearing a size 16 as I saw myself as fat, frumpy, and completely unattractive. His sister was a size 6, and boy did I get the shock of my life when the clothes fit. I didn't know it at the time, but I actually weighed 5.5 stone and could fit into a child size 11 years old up until the age of 18. To me, this was the start of a better life, right? Unfortunately not. I knew I had to do whatever he said to keep my place there. This meant humiliation and degradation, as we never actually ended up having sex. The events that stick out most clearly in my mind are him inviting my first future husband over and telling him the abuse I had suffered, so I could take anything. Pain meant nothing to me. I knew I had to go along with this, so I bolstered myself and said I could take anything, which was probably true. But this was my big mistake. He made me lie flat on my stomach, took off his belt, and began to whip the backs of my thighs, whilst making me stare at his friends so he could verify I wouldn't cry or show any pain. So this is what I did. I blanked out. I didn't cry, I didn't move, I didn't show anything. And then I turned over and he did the same on the front. I showed nothing, and they began to laugh and joke about it because it's so funny, right? Whilst I just sat there numb for days, after there was no part of the top of my legs that wasn't black. I just took them as my war wounds, despite it being painful to move or sit or lie down. The other event was another friend came over, and I was made to strip naked before they came into the bedroom. I was allowed the duvet to cover me, because that is just so gentlemanly, right? And they both just sat there laughing and stroking and trying to pull the covers off me, causing me more pain than the whipping. I was humiliated, felt so vulnerable and mad that I put myself in another abusive situation to try and save myself from the previous one, being my mother. This would go on to be a dangerous pattern I adopted, convincing myself the next relationship was always better than the one before. To find a way to survive, I will continue this topic next week, moving on to my first husband. In the short weeks I was with my first abusive partner, he physically, emotionally, and mentally tortured me. But it was better than my mother, right? Until next week, be the voice, be the change.